Before maps learned to whisper Timbuktu, before the Atlantic remade the world, the Niger already carried the weight of kings. One name rose above the dust. Askia, the general who took a crown and gave an empire a spine. He stretched Songhai from salt pits to savannas, made markets march like battalions, and courts speak with a single voice. He walked to Mecca under desert stars, returned with legitimacy and a mission to bind conquest to law. This isn't a tale of gold alone. It's a story of statecraft, faith, legacy, and Africa's golden blueprint. Stay with us. The story of Askia the Great begins now. Welcome to African history. Before the Atlantic winds carried new empires across West Africa's shores, and long before European maps learned to write Timbuktu with reverence, the Niger River held its own world of power. Canoes cut its brown waters like moving fortresses. Markets hummed with gold and salt, and on the desert's edge, caravan bells chimed like iron birds. In this theater of river and sand stepped a figure whose name would become a measure for kingship in the Western Sudan. Askia Muhammad, remembered simply as Askia the Great. His story begins with a single problem that plagues every rising empire: how to transform conquest into governance. Sunni Ali before him had built Songhai's reach with fire and horse, seizing cities from rivals and humbling those who stood in his path. But the muscle of a realm is not the same as its spine. It takes institutions to make far-off towns behave like provinces, laws to make strangers pay taxes, scribes to make promises to live longer than the men who spoke them. Askia the Great was the man who gave Songhai that spine, binding conquest to law and ambition to a disciplined state. The tale that follows is the arc of a life one that stretches from the river town of Gao to the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, from skirmishes in scrubland to alliances hammered out in courtyards thick with incense and dust. It is the story of how an outsider seized a throne and, in just 3.5 decades, turned a growing kingdom into a political machine whose rhythm could be heard from the salt pits of Taghaza to the scholarly courtyards of Timbuktu. Muhammad Touré was not born wearing the mantle of inevitability. He emerged from the web of Songhai's warrior aristocracy, a seasoned commander steeped in the rugged school of campaigns under Sunni Ali. He learned logistics the hard way, counting sacks of grain at dusk and scouting dry riverbeds at noon, balancing what courage could do against what fodder and forage would allow. He watched empires breathe, expand, contract, then, if they lacked careful hands, break. When Sunni Ali died in 1492, the empire he had stretched across the middle Niger did not automatically belong to the man best suited to run it. Power flowed to his son, Sunni Baru, as custom demanded. But custom is a weak oath if the army is restless and the clerics discontent. Sunni Baru lacked his father's aura and, in the eyes of many scholars, lacked devout commitment to the faith, whose prestige ran like a golden thread through West Africa's merchant cities. Muhammad Touré, a general with the soldier's ear and the scholar's blessing, grasped that the next Songhai ruler would need more than the right blood. He would need the right argument. His argument came dressed in piety and practicality. He presented himself as the man who would marry the conquests of Sunni Ali to the law of Islam, who would pacify the markets, secure the routes, regularize taxation, and honor the scholars who gave legitimacy to kings. Many who disliked Sunni Ali's hard hand but admired his achievements now saw a way to keep the gains and lose the grievances. In 1493, Muhammad Touré acted at Anfao, near Gao. His forces met those loyal to Sunni Baru. The battle did not last long enough to etch 100 heroes into memory. It was a contest decided as much by alliances and morale as by steel. When it ended, the general had become the monarch. Names carry histories. The title he took Askia meant ruler, yet its origin also bore the sting of usurpation in some tellings. He embraced it. Legitimacy, after all, could be engineered. By the justice a ruler performed, the peace he enforced, the taxes he collected fairly, the scholars he nourished, and the piety he displayed. If the crown might whisper that he was not Sunni Ali's son, the empire would shout back that he was Songhai's architect. In the early days of his reign, Askia Muhammad did what wise rulers do. He tested the hinges of the realm, found the weak ones, and reinforced them. He traveled, listened, and counted cities that paid tribute, and those that merely promised, counted the number of horsemen a governor could actually field and not just claim, counted bales of salt and sacks of grain, counted the clerics whose loyalty could not be purchased but had to be earned. Above all, he counted time. He knew that the window for consolidating a crown seized in battle was short. He needed spectacle and law, fear and favor in the right proportion and in quick succession. Empires expand for many reasons: fear, greed, religion, geography, and Askia's Songhai embodied all four. But where Sunni Ali's campaigns had been about battering open gates, Askia's were about making those gates pay the empire year after year without breaking them again. His wars had aims beyond victory. They had budgets and deadlines. They were not simply about defeating a ruler, but about writing his successor into a ledger. He started where the map's ink was still wet. The western marches, once Mali's pride, demanded attention. The ghost of Mali's empire still haunted trade routes, and every caravan that slipped through without a Songhai toll was a small rebellion. Askia moved to assert control over the gold-bearing corridors and riverine ports that fed the world's hunger for West African wealth. Fortress towns that had promised tribute under Sunni Ali were reminded, now with polite letters or pointed spears, that promises survive kings. To the south, the mossy state's formidable horsemen of the savannah represented both a military threat and a religious frontier. Askia rode against them not merely as a conqueror, but as a defender of an Islamic sphere, a vocabulary that spoke well to the clerics and lent moral color to steel. He forced acknowledgments of Songhai supremacy, not always permanent, but enough to turn raids into negotiations and frontiers into buffers. Eastward, the Hausa city-states Katsina, Zaria, Gobir, and especially Kano-ware sophisticated urban centers, whose wealth grew from crafts, markets, and long-distance trade. Seizing them outright would cripple the hand that counted taxes. Askia's campaigns in Hausaland therefore mixed the sword with the marriage bed and the treaty seal. The story is told of his daughter's marriage into Kano's court an alliance that ensured a flow of tribute and respect without the destructive costs of occupation. This was Askia's genius in motion, an economy of force, where a dowry could accomplish what a siege would squander. Northward, the desert looked empty to those who could not read its grammar. Askia could. He knew that the Sahara was not a barrier, but a braided road. Whoever controlled Taghaza controlled salt. Whoever controlled salt controlled trade. Whoever controlled trade controlled the empire's balance sheet. Under his watch, Songhai's hand closed around the salt pits, with a grip firm enough to be felt in markets as far as Fez and Tunis. He sent men into the desert not as adventurers, but as accountants with spears, to certify that taxes and tolls became coin and grain. The Tuareg confederations that nestled in oasis cities like Agadez and Air were not merely neighbors, they were gatekeepers of Saharan corridors. Askia understood that a river can be patrolled by boats, but a desert requires agreements. He negotiated where possible and fought where necessary, reshaping the politics of the northern routes so that Songhai's reach was not only deep, but durable. Agadez, when brought within Songhai's arch, did not merely change flags, it changed the velocity of commerce. And always, threading through these campaigns, was the river. Askia invested in a Niger fleet canoes, built stout, crews trained well, officers made responsible, not only for fighting, but for keeping time. Grain moved on those boats, soldiers too, and messages that could travel faster by water than by hoof. The river became not a line on a map, but an artery, pumping life from Gao into the far limbs of the empire. Wars are judged by the peace they purchase. As the campaigns matured, a pattern emerged. Some regions absorbed and governed directly, others left as tributaries with local rulers intact, others entangled through marriages and merchant guilds. The empire's outline on the sand might shift with seasons, but the flow of tribute, taxes, and respect became constant enough to finance an experiment Askia was determined to try. Government by design. Askia Muhammad inherited a throne. He built a state. The distinction matters because the first can be defended with cavalry and charisma, but the second requires patience, paper, and people who know how to use both. He set out to create an administration that would make Songhai's vastness legible to itself. He divided the empire into provinces units, with borders inked not only by geography, but by how goods and people actually moved. Over each province he set a governor, whose loyalty flowed first to the crown. Some were kin, some trusted lieutenants. All were supervised. In the capital, a council of officers, more than courtiers and less than kings, handled the specialized work of state. Their titles mattered less than their portfolios. Finance to count revenue and delay expenditures until the coin arrived. Justice to keep the peace and give merchants confidence that contracts would be honored. The river fleet to keep supply lines breathing. Protocol to manage the court's rituals that turned raw power into accepted order. Weights and measures sound like small politics, until a merchant cheats a measure of salt or a tax farmer invents a new barrel. Askia standardized them. A bushel in Jenne would match a bushel in Gao. A rod of cloth in Katsina would measure the same in Timbuktu 28. Trade thrives on predictability, and tax collection thrives on trade. By making the market's yardsticks uniform, he cut a quiet canal through the chaos of custom, and the empire's coffers deepened without a single soldier drawing steel. Taxes themselves were reorganized, where tribute had been paid in promises. He demanded it in kind or coin, and on a schedule. Levies on caravans became formal tolls. River checkpoints became predictable stops rather than opportunities for arbitrary extortion. None of this was painless. No reform that turns custom into system ever is. But the long-term consequence was that the empire behaved more like a coordinated organism than a herd. Agriculture, the empire's base, received engineering rather than poetry. Canals were dug and maintained along fertile stretches of the Niger, not as imperial monuments, but as systems that turned seasonal bounty into reliable harvests. Granaries rose, and with them, the confidence that a bad year would not starve the army or hollow the cities. In this, Askia showed an instinct that marks high statecraft. Glory on the battlefield is paid for with rice in the storehouse. He also understood the administrative value of people unanchored by clan politics. He elevated some slaves and clients into roles where personal loyalty could override the tangled obligations of lineage. These men, reliant on the crown for status, became capable administrators and soldiers' sharp tools that cut cleanly because they cut only in the ruler's hand. It was a risk, as all concentration of power is, but it strengthened the center while provincial elites found their own power trimmed to size. Law under Askia acquired both a new texture and a wider jurisdiction. Urban courts adjudicated disputes with an eye toward consistency, increasingly drawing on Islamic jurisprudence in commercial, family, and criminal matters. Judges Qadis were appointed in major cities, not only for piety's sake, but because a merchant who trusts a court will risk larger ventures. Rural areas kept layers of customary practice. Askia did not attempt to paint the entire map with one legal brush. The result was a hybrid legality that felt familiar to villagers and reassuring to traders. Communications stitched all this together. Messengers moved along the river and roads with orders that were clear and deadlines that were taken seriously. The court kept records, not as archival vanity, but as living tools, lists of levies due and received, Cases tried and judgments made, officers appointed and dismissed. The empire's memory lengthened, and with it, the possibility of making policy that extended beyond a single season. There was the theater of rule. Askia grasped that power must be seen to be believed. The court ceremonies became calculated performances of order, audiences where governors stood in ranks before the throne, festivals where scholars recited and the poor received alms, processions where the fleet's officers marched in their river-washed finery. These were not distractions, they were rituals that taught the empire to recognize its own face. If the administration provided the bones of Askia's Songhai, Islam gave it a heart that beat in time with cities far beyond the desert. He was a devout Muslim, and equally important, a politically intelligent one. He did not force conversions across the countryside. He cultivated an Islamic public sphere in the cities and at court that could authenticate his rule in the eyes of scholars from Timbuktu to Cairo. His policies unfolded along three complementary lines: patronage, law, and example. Patronage began with scholars. Timbuktu was already a city of learning, with the Sankore complex and other madrasas drawing students from across the Sahel. Askia widened those channels. He extended stipends to jurists and teachers, endowed study circles, and invited learned men from the Maghreb to his court. When a scholar arrived with a library, the king of Songhai welcomed not only a man but a corpus that could anchor jurisprudence and philosophy in his cities. Timbuktu's shelves thickened with commentaries and compendia. The city's reputation grew not merely as a market, but as a mine. Law came next. Askia formalized the place of Islamic jurisprudence in urban courts. Commercial disputes, inheritance cases, and marital law increasingly found resolution through Sharia, as interpreted by local qadis. The intent was not to erase custom, but to interface it with a legal tradition respected across the Islamic world. A merchant from Tlemcen or Tunis could walk into a Timbuktu court and find familiar procedures, familiar texts, familiar arguments. Law thus became diplomacy by other means. Every judgment that echoed Cairo or Fez stitched Songhai more tightly into the fabric of the Ummah. Example reached its apex in his pilgrimage, the Hajj of 1497-98. It was spectacle and sincerity in equal measure. Askia did not go alone. He traveled with an entourage that declared West Africa's wealth in the idiom of the Muslim world: gifts for the poor, patronage for scholars, reverence at holy places. In Cairo, he conversed with dignitaries who had heard stories of Mansa Musa's earlier pilgrimage and now saw another king of the Western Sudan confirm the region's eminence. In Mecca and Medina, he prayed and paid for lodging to host pilgrims from the Bilad al-Sudan in years to come, for charity that announced the piety of a far-off empire, for the kind of recognition that only peers can confer. When he secured acknowledgment styled by later chroniclers as a caliphal dignity over the Western lands, he returned with more than blessings. He carried a certificate of legitimacy stamped by the sacred geography of Islam. Back in Gao and Timbuktu, the pilgrimage bore lasting fruit. The court's Islam became more explicit in its rituals. The urban elite's dress and manners shifted toward Maghrebi models. The rhythm of the year took stronger cues from the Islamic calendar. He encouraged practices like veiling among urban women and observance of Ramadan with public gravity signals that the capital danced to the same tune as the cities beyond the desert. Yet he did not break the drumbeat of local tradition. In rural communities, ancestral rites continued, and Askia's policy was not to extinguish them, but to avoid letting them challenge the Islamic character of the state. The result was a layered Islamization, heaviest in the cities and lighter in the countryside, but coherent enough to give Songhai a recognizable profile in the wider Muslim world. Intellectual exchange followed. Books moved with caravans as reliably as salt. Ideas crossed deserts even faster than merchants, carried in the heads of students who had read the same texts in different accents. In this climate, the empire's politics acquired an additional anchor: the opinions of jurists whose authority could not be bought but had to be courted, argued with, and sometimes conceded to. Askia, ever the pragmatist, accepted this, because he understood that a king's law is stronger when the learned call it just. Askia the Great reigned for 35 years, and history measures those years not only by miles of border gained, but by the deeper, quieter distances traveled, from improvisation to institution, from bravado to bureaucracy, from the prestige of a conqueror to the steadier fame of a lawgiver. He could not escape the human bookend of decline. Age found his eyes and dimmed them. Palace politics found its moment and bit. In 1528, he was dethroned by his own son, a grim lesson in the limits of both blood and design. But even as he receded from court, the state he built did not vanish with him. It continued, sometimes haltingly, sometimes boldly, under successors who inherited not his charisma but his machinery. The measure of his achievement is this: when later centuries argued about what an African empire could be, they reached for the language his reign supplied. They spoke of provinces guarded by governors, of courts where qadis weighed testimony and coin, of caravans that crossed the desert knowing where they would be taxed and how much. They spoke of scholars who found in Timbuktu a home that felt like Fez with a different sun. They spoke of a river that had learned to carry not only boats, but a bureaucracy's breath. Even the end of Songhai, felled in 1591 by Moroccan muskets, could not silence what Askia had orchestrated. The manuscripts endured. The courtyards endured, if not as capitals, then as schools. The memory of a ruler who turned a rough empire into a designed one endured most of all. Askia Muhammad did not merely inherit the Niger's bend. He taught it to bend toward order. In a world where power too often burns bright and brief, he made something harder and more worthwhile, a system that could glow after the fire cooled. And so the river keeps moving past Gao, as it did in his day. Markets still assemble when the heat lifts, voices mixing languages the desert taught to get along. Somewhere a student opens an old manuscript and sees a margin note in a hand that knew both Arabic and the taste of Sahel dust. The empire is gone. The tomb remains, and between them stretches a name that time has not dared to diminish: Askia the Great. The Niger still flows past Gao, carrying echoes of an empire that once bent rivers, deserts, and scholars to its rhythm. The markets hum, the manuscripts breathe, and somewhere a student still traces the ink of Askia's world with curious fingers. Askia Muhammad was more than a conqueror. He was an architect of order, a ruler who turned conquest into law and ambition into system. His throne has long been emptied, but the memory of his reign remains carved into Africa's imagination, a reminder that power is not only taken, it is designed. Empires fall, dynasties break, but the legacy of Askia the Great endures. In every manuscript that whispers his time, in every market that still beats with Songhai's rhythm, in every lesson that governance outlasts the sword. For in the end, his true victory was not the land he claimed, but the order he left behind. A legacy still glowing on the bend of the Niger, long after the fire cooled. Subscribe to African History, where forgotten stories rise again, and the ancestors speak through the dust.